Today's video is sponsored by Raycon, home of wireless earbud designs inspired by underdogs and big dreams. Raycon earbuds start at about half the price of other premium wireless earbud brands, but they sound just as amazing as other top audio brands. And they look pretty cool too. Check it out. These are the everyday E25 earbuds, super soft and flexible to fit different sized ears. They also have a range of colors. What I'm loving about them is the seamless Bluetooth pairing, so I can easily listen to podcasts and audiobooks when I'm on the go. These everyday E25s are good for 6 hours of continuous playtime. But this handy case doubles as a charger, and you can recharge up to 4 times while you're out and about, commuting, at the gym, or wherever life takes you. So, if you want a premium earbud at about half the price of other brands, just go to buyraycon.com/VisualPolitik to get 15% off your order. And now, let's get into today's video. Let's be honest, I'm sure the vast majority of you have seen these unbelievable images of Detroit full of abandoned factories, desolate streets, and neighborhoods with lots of houses boarded up, abandoned, or literally falling down. The most populous city in the state of Michigan became a vital player as the American capital of the automotive sector, and therefore also the car capital of the world. Important companies such as Ford or General Motors had their production centers right here. As a result, in 1950, this city had almost 2 million inhabitants, and by that time, Detroit had become one of the most attractive places for thousands and thousands of workers across the country who longed to achieve what is known as the American dream. We're talking about a city that was once the 4th largest city in the United States, behind only New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. However, something happened, and from the 1950s on, everything began to collapse like a house of cards. Many companies began to close. There were cuts in production chains, and many factories of support companies in the automotive sector were affected. It all started to fall apart. And look, proof of the storm that had just been set in motion is the fact that by 1960, Detroit had already lost nearly 200,000 inhabitants. Yes, 200,000 fewer inhabitants in just 10 years. Even worse, since that time, the city has been diminishing decade after decade until today. And at this very moment, the population of the city barely exceeds 670,000 inhabitants. As you could see in the chart, the data doesn't lie. It almost looks like the depiction of a city doomed to become a ghost town. In addition, the vast majority of those who stayed had very low incomes, people who, in many cases, live in virtually marginal, extremely poor, and very insecure environments. The point is that with this phenomenon, we can find 2 great leading lines of argument: those who blame capitalism and those who blame the complete opposite, bad policies that led to this ghastly situation. But the truth is that in one way or another, for many people, Detroit has become something of a living example of the failure of American capitalism, or at least an example that the American dream that so many talk about doesn't always work. Now, is this really the case? Was it really evil capitalism that caused the fall of Detroit? What is the city really like today, and what future does this city have? Well, these and other questions are what we're going to try to answer for you here today on VisualPolitik. Let's get into it.
The roar of the engine.
Look at these images. Each of those empty spaces you see on the blocks were once houses. But then why are there so many gaps? Because over the past few years, the Detroit City Council has tried to tear down every abandoned house to avoid it being occupied, used for illegal activities, or for the use of prohibited substances. That is, to avoid as much possible new pockets of uncontrolled criminality. Once, however, all those slums were normal, middle and working class residential areas, like those we could find in any other US city. But these days, they are places best avoided, because the truth is, if you do go and then manage to get out safely with all your belongings, you could consider yourself a very lucky person. The fact is that these neighborhoods were the result of a huge demographic boom. In about 3 decades, in just 30 years, between 1920 and 1950, Detroit's population doubled, and in 10 years from 1920 to 1930, the population grew by nearly 6 600,000. So the question is, why did so many people suddenly start coming to Detroit? What did the city offer? Where did they all come from? Well, from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Detroit began to develop a powerful automotive industry. Dozens of small factories of early model and rudimentary cars began to open in different parts of the city, and one of them was precisely that of Henry Ford, who founded the Detroit Automobile Company there in 1899. Initially, business wasn't as good as expected, and just 2 years later, it closed down, having sold only 20 cars and lost the equivalent of more than $2.5 million in today's money. And after Ford's second failed attempt, the Ford Motor Company was founded in 1903, with an investment of less than $800,000 in today's dollars. And as the saying goes, third time lucky. Note that, despite what we've always been told, Henry Ford was not the first to have an automobile production line. No, the first mass-produced car was in fact an Oldsmobile, the curved dash. However, what is true is that was Ford who managed to bring the system to levels of efficiency and profitability never seen before in such a way that he managed to reduce both costs and production times dramatically. In fact, Fordism, which is how this production system is known, was what changed Detroit forever. And take note, because I'm not just referring to the city's economy or its industrial model, but also to its demographic structure. Ford's model began to be replicated and factories started to grow and grow. And of course, that meant more and more workers were needed, which caused a boom in new inhabitants who were mostly members of African American communities of the South. And that, well, let's say it wasn't that simple. Think about it. We're talking about the early 20th century. At the time, the United States, like virtually all Western countries, was tremendously racist. And of course, in that context, the arrival of thousands of black people in a city that until then had been mostly white generated all kinds of problems, great racial tension, and a huge mistrust among the local inhabitants. And this is why whites began to move to the periphery, to newly built residential areas, so that Detroit's most central areas became the modest and marginal areas over the years, because of social exclusion and a pressing lack of sufficient housing for all the workers who were arriving. But at this point, many of you may be thinking, but hang on Josh, what on earth do racial tensions and housing problems have to do with the decline of Detroit? Well, a lot more than we might think at first glance. You see, all these racial tensions were fed and grew over the years, and sometimes they ended up exploding, eventually even causing a very serious unrest. Riots such as 1967, where, because of a false rumor, more than 2,500 shops belonging to the white population were looted, and where more than 400 buildings, including many residential buildings and houses, were burned, razed to the ground. And here we arrive at a crucial moment. What do you think the authorities' response was? Well, for many experts, it is precisely here that is the real source of a problem that has continued to this present day. Politicians in Detroit and Michigan did not want anything similar to the 1967 riots to ever happen again, so they undertook ambitious social programs such as hiring black minorities in the public sector, subsidizing and launching the Fair Housing Act, an ambitious affordable housing program that sought to settle the lower earning population in downtown Detroit, an urban space emptied by the march of the white population to the outskirts and other cities. Detroit thus became a great testing lab, but this social experiment failed miserably. Over the years, this kind of policy caused many of Detroit's inhabitants to become public government renters, which over the years created a new social divide. A large part of the population was not integrated into the productive sector and had no incentives to compete. Even worse, these kinds of policies didn't work when it came to correcting the big problems the city was going through. They did nothing to alleviate social exclusion or racial tensions. White flight from businesses and neighborhoods was not stopped. Violence was not tackled, and the creation of new businesses was not stimulated. And so, little by little, Detroit faded away. Surprised? Well, wait a minute, because that was only the beginning. To top it off, the old car factories of the early 20th century began to close. They were no longer feasible for the enormous production required by the new times, nor for the growing automation that was beginning to be used in this kind of plant. So the big automobile brands began to build new factories, first on the periphery, on the outskirts of Detroit, and later in the face of the city's growing conflict and the higher tax and labor costs that were a result of all those social plans. The specialist technicians took their factories elsewhere in the United States, which of course only accelerated the process of depopulation and impoverishment of the city. And so, as the businesses and residents that could afford to pack up and find a new place to start over continue to leave, so little by little, Detroit became a city increasingly dependent on social programs. And that, in turn, made the city's financial situation an enormous ticking time bomb. On one hand, the loss of population and productive infrastructure caused tax revenues to sink, but on the other hand, the different mayors of Detroit kept spending money in huge amounts to try and reverse the problem, from huge social plans to major public works programs. And of course, if on one hand we have less income and on the other hand we spend more, then disaster is just around the corner. And you know what? That pretty much explains what happened. The city's finances were getting worse until finally in 2013, the city faced default. Basically, Detroit went bankrupt. But hold on a minute, because here, right here, is where a completely different story begins. You want to know what today's Detroit looks like and what tomorrow's Detroit might look like? Well, read on.
A new start for Detroit. Is it possible?
Imagine the situation for a moment. Think of it as a mental exercise. Before the 2013 default, Detroit was so ruined that it didn't even have the money to keep basic utilities to a decent level. No garbage, no water, no pipe maintenance or sewers. Needless to say, no security either. Over the years, the city has accumulated a huge $14 billion debt, and in 2013 alone, the city's budget deficit reached nearly $320 million. And remember, we're talking about a city that, at the time, had only 690,000 inhabitants. That is, the municipal debt was more than $20,000 for each inhabitant. And that is a lot of money for a small city council. In fact, it is almost as much as all the public debt per capita of a country. For example, Spain, taking into account all local councils, regions, the central government, etc. And of course, a city hall has neither the resources nor the sources of income that an entire country has. Well, the thing is, this situation caused the city to enforce a number of severe cuts. For example, public employees had to accept significant pay cuts and forced unpaid leave, and the United States federal government itself had to intervene in the accounts of the city to restructure them. The good news for Detroit is that this whole process didn't last long. Following the intervention of the federal government and agreements to eliminate and restructure more than $7 billion in debt, the city managed to get out of its bankruptcy. As a side note, this basically means that the many creditors lost a good portion of their money. And careful here, because we're talking about things like pension funds, for example. However, since then, the city has had to follow a strict spending control plan that has forced the authorities to submit surplus accounts year after year, something that has allowed the debt to continue to be reduced whilst gradually improving security conditions and public services at the same time. For example, the empty plots we saw at the beginning of this video were occupied by ruined houses that in many cases functioned as dens of crime. The city council didn't even have the money to demolish them. However, all of this gradually changed after the default. In fact, against all odds, Detroit has become a small investment center. Private investment has been returning to the city in recent years.
People that were once fearful in investing in the city just fell over themselves to invest in Detroit. If you go to Detroit now, it's a different city than it was 5 years ago. It has a different image, and it is a vibrant city. James McTevier, managing member of McTevier Associates in Detroit.
Many of these investments are coming mostly from large capital in New York and Los Angeles, and to this day, it is possible to see rehabilitation projects of gigantic buildings that were abandoned in the heart of the city. And not only that, even industry itself is starting to flourish again.
Fiat Chrysler plans Michigan investment with 6,500 jobs. The New York Times. The Italian-American automaker said it plans to spend $4.5 billion over the next 3 years to update several Detroit plants and retool an engine plant to make Jeeps. An effort the company said would create about 6,500 new jobs.
And there's even more. In 2018, the Ford Motor Company purchased the former Michigan Central Station, a large abandoned area that is always shown in Detroit footage, and began rehabilitating it with a $740 million investment. Ford's idea is to move its autonomous vehicle development team to this building, gradually giving a second chance to the city that saw them initially succeed. What's more, from a social point of view, one of the programs that is generating most hope is curiously an ambitious reintegration plan that the authorities have put in place for all those who have been in prison. And friends, believe me, we talk about a lot of people. Remember that this city has suffered with decades of crime and that it is still one of the most dangerous places in the United States. To give you an idea, about 15% of the population of this city has a history of serious crime. Well, the Michigan Department of Corrections releases about 9,000 inmates each year, 25% of whom end up going to Wayne County in Detroit. Getting out of jail and being reintegrated into society is difficult in any country, but in the United States, it can become even more so. About 60% of people on parole in Michigan do not have a job, and many are tempted to return to some sort of crime in order to survive. Another problem faced is that many fail to find a landlord who wants to rent them a place to live. Therefore, Detroit City has passed an ordinance that prevents the vast majority of landlords from being able to rule out renting a home to a person based on their criminal record. Plans have also been put into place to promote the labor participation of former prisoners, and partnerships have been set up to accompany these people to achieve full reintegration. By the way, this topic we need to talk about in much more detail. We'll have to make another video. However, friends, the situation today is that despite all the achievements that have been seen in recent years in Detroit, the crisis of the coronavirus pandemic is putting all those advances at risk once more.
As the coronavirus takes hold in Detroit, pandemic magnifies city's poverty, racial disparities. CNBC.
Indeed, the great economic crisis that is coming because of this pandemic is putting many of the investments that Detroit had secured at risk, as investing in Detroit carries far more risk than investments in other parts of the United States. And besides, the coronavirus hit Detroit pretty hard. Even worse, the population most affected by the pandemic is precisely the most vulnerable, the African American population. Anyway, this is the story of the Golden Age, the rapid fall and the apparent rebirth of one of the most important cities of the industrial surge in the 20th century, and a symbol of America's economic power. A city that illustrates how, on many occasions, the intent of public policies falls far short of the results. But now it's your turn. Do you think Detroit could become America's new car capital in a couple of decades? Can the city get over the coronavirus crisis and continue to grow once the worst of the pandemic passes? What do you think we can learn from how racial tensions and how bad public policies ended one of America's most vibrant cities? Leave your answers in the comments. So, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, the channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll be seeing you in the next video.